What about hallucinations?
Could the appearances have been mere hallucinatory experiences? Well, I'm skeptical about this hypothesis, frankly. I think that there are a number of reasons to think that this hypothesis is not the best explanation. First of all, it's very difficult to explain the diversity of the resurrection appearances. Jesus didn't appear just once, but many times, not just to one person, but to many different individuals. Not just to individuals, but to groups of people, not just under one circumstance and at one locale, but in many locales and under a variety of circumstances. And the hallucination hypothesis simply can't be plausibly stretched to accommodate this kind of diversity. Let me just give 3 examples. The appearance, for example, to James, the younger brother of Jesus. We have good evidence from the Gospels that neither James nor indeed any of Jesus' brothers believed that Jesus was anybody special during his lifetime, that he was the Messiah or the Savior or anybody of any significance. And yet it's equally undeniable that after his death, both James and the younger brothers of Jesus all became believers, became ardent followers of Jesus in the New Testament church, and eventually James emerges as the sole leader of the New Testament church. That's all we know about James from the New Testament, but from Josephus, the Jewish historian, that James was actually stoned to death by the Sanhedrin during a lapse in the civil government somewhere in the mid-60s for his faith in Jesus Christ. Now, most of us have brothers. What would it take for you to believe that your brother is the Lord so that you would be willing to be stoned to death for the truth of that belief? Can there be any doubt that the reason for this incredible transformation in James is the fact, as Paul says, then he appeared to James? You can't, I think, explain the conversion of James as due to a hallucination, because as an unbeliever, James wasn't in any sort of chain reaction of enthusiasm among believers. He wasn't a follower of Jesus. So the hallucination hypothesis doesn't hold much credibility for the appearance to James. Another one that's difficult to explain, I think, would be the appearance to the women. Again, it's remarkable that women would be the first to see Jesus risen from the dead. Any later legendary account would make male disciples to be the first ones to see Jesus risen. Now, that suggests that the women were the first ones, in fact, to see Christ risen from the dead. The reason they're not mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15 in the list that Paul quotes is because the testimony of women was so worthless that listing them among the list of witnesses would have been actually detrimental. It would have been counterproductive rather than helpful. So they're omitted from the list in 1 Corinthians 15. But we have multiple independent attestation of the appearance to the women in the Gospels. Now that's significant because, again, it means that you cannot explain the appearance to the women as being part of a chain reaction through, say, a guilt complex that Peter suffered because he had denied Jesus 3 times, as some of the skeptical critics would want us to believe. The women have priority over Peter here, and they didn't suffer from any guilt complex because they didn't deny Jesus. They were at the cross. They were at the tomb when he was buried. They came to the tomb on Sunday morning to find the body gone. So that the women didn't suffer from any sort of guilt complexes, as is hypothesized for Peter by those who defend the hallucination hypothesis. Finally, just a third example that is difficult for the hallucination hypothesis to explain would be the appearance to the 500 brethren. Here you have 500 people, most of whom are still alive at the time of Paul's writing. He knows them personally because he knows some have died in the interim. And all of them claim to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. Now, again, mass hallucinations are extremely rare because as projections of your own mind, they are only in the mind of the percipient, and therefore you cannot have literally a mass hallucination. It would have to be really a mass coincidence of all these people hallucinating Jesus at the same time. Now that's not impossible, but again, when you look at the diversity of the appearances, this just begins to strain the hallucination hypothesis, I think, to the breaking point. One further problem with the hallucination hypothesis is that it has weak explanatory power. It's offered as an explanation of the appearances. But in fact, it does not explain why the disciples came to believe Jesus was risen from the dead. For you see, given the typical Jewish mentality about beliefs in the afterlife, they would have believed that Jesus would have gone to Abraham's bosom, to paradise, where the souls of the righteous dead would be with God until the resurrection at the end of the world. And therefore, if they had hallucinated visions of Jesus, they would have projected visions of him as exalted in heaven, where God had taken him up until the resurrection at the end of the world. But that would at most have led them to proclaim the assumption of Jesus into heaven, or the glorification of Jesus in heaven, not his literal resurrection from the dead. For the Jew, the resurrection was an event that took place in space and time, in history. And therefore, something more is needed than just hallucinations of the dead man to explain why they came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, rather than merely his translation into heaven. One final point about the hallucination hypothesis is that it lacks explanatory scope sufficient to explain the evidence. It's only offered to explain the appearances. But you see, that's only one part of the evidence. In order to explain the empty tomb, you have to conjoin to the hallucination hypothesis some independent hypothesis in order to explain that data. But the resurrection hypothesis, as an overarching hypothesis, has wider explanatory scope, and therefore, according to the canons of inductive reasoning, is to be preferred.